Hello and welcome to the President's Podcast right here on the record with the Ohio Senate. The views the news excludes. I'm John Fortney, the Director of Communication with the Senate Republican Caucus. That's the majority caucus in the Ohio Senate. Great to have back on the program because we call it the President's Podcast. Ohio Senate President Rob McColley, Republican from the 1st District. That's Napoleon, Ohio.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be here, John.
Well, how was your summer? I haven't seen you for a while. I mean, everybody goes back to their districts and works, but how's the family? How was your summer?
It's been good. It's been great to get back in the district, get around to a number of meetings in the district, but also have the opportunity to spend a little time with the family, enjoy a little bit of summer and an extended summer as it may appear, but that's okay. It's good to be back.
And then last week, right back to work, serious legislation, the veto override, the first of maybe several more to come, but really regarding the Senate and the House, the General Assembly's reforms on property taxes. These were significant reforms on property taxes that were vetoed by the executive branch, by the governor, and overrode the first one last week. What's your overall message about what's to come and why these are important reforms?
Yeah, my overall message is we need to make significant reform. It's a kitchen table issue in the state of Ohio. Ohio taxpayers are frustrated and fed up with our property tax system. It's a broken system. It's incumbent upon us to fix it, and so we're going to fix it. And we're not done with just these items that were put in the budget and the overrides that we might be doing. There are a number of items that are going to continue to come up throughout this fall. It will be a very active legislative session this fall to try and address the issue even more. And so I would expect people stay tuned. We're taking it very seriously. We're trying to offer tax relief. We're trying to fix the system as it stands right now, and really as simple as taking it back to what it was supposed to be, largely anti-inflationary and largely decided upon by the voters without unvoted tax increases.
And over the years, getting around those anti-inflationary guardrails is something that new terminology like emergency levies, substitute emergency levies, replacement levies that all fell outside of that 20 mil floor, so they raised more money without a vote of the people as the valuations progressed.
Well, and that was the override that we just took up last week that is now going to become law against the veto of the governor. And really what it was is these were the items that we saw that were contributing to many of the unvoted tax increases every time there was a revaluation of property in these counties. And it was largely items that were outside of the 20 mil floor calculation, meaning you could be treated as if you're at only 20 mils and get the inflationary increase associated with that whenever there's a revaluation, but also collect your full amount on top of that if you passed a certain type of levy. And so we sought to eliminate those types of levies, again, to get it back to what it was supposed to be, and that if you were truly at 20 mils, so be it, but you shouldn't be able to collect 27 mils and be treated as if you're only collecting 20 mils and then get the inflationary bump associated with that.
It's also important to have your local watchdog on that, calling the County Budget Commission, something that also was part of the veto message from the governor on the operating budget. How important is the County Budget Commission? Because I believe it was Senator Lang, and I'll double check this, but I believe it was Senator Lang talking about how Butler County actually rolled back the millage or adjusted the millage, so it is only raising that certain level of money, that certain amount of money, instead of letting it continue to grow out of bounds without a vote of the people.
This was something that we put into the budget as well, allowing for local county commissioners to take a vote, to be able to roll back their millage, to be able to give tax relief to voters. And kudos to Butler County for realizing they had received enough of a windfall from the revaluation that occurred down there, which was pretty drastic down in Butler County. But that they had received enough of a windfall and they could live on lower revenues. And so giving that back to the taxpayer, that's exactly why we put that language in the budget.
And of course, a lot of people like to talk about the potential to see a property tax repeal as a constitutional amendment on next year's ballot, which might sound good on the surface to a lot of people, but if that would pass, say goodbye to your local control. Isn't that what property taxes really exhibit, really represent local control of whether you want to pass a levy for new school buildings or you want to pass a levy for your local library or your local transportation system, because that would do away with a gigantic amount of local control under property taxes, which are really a local issue.
Yeah, exactly. And To put this in perspective, the state of Ohio collects $0 in property taxes. None of that money comes down to Columbus for us. All the money stays in local government's hands to fund your police and fire, to fund your schools, to fund your board of DD, to fund all sorts of local services that are used locally. And so to put this in perspective, the state of Ohio raises approximately $30 billion a year in taxation. It's about $10 billion a year from income tax, about $16 billion a year from sales tax, and the remainder from a number of other smaller taxes. Statewide, there are raised about $22 billion in property taxes. So it may sound like an appealing idea on the surface to eliminate property taxes and then just let the state pick up the tab. I have news for you. The state cannot pick up a tab that big unless people are willing to have their income taxes go up to near 10% and their sales tax go up to about 18%. And just the disaster that would wreak on the economy is not good in and of itself. And so what it comes down to is if we truly want it to be a system where the voters in their local political subdivision and taxing jurisdictions are in charge, then we need to put them back in charge by eliminating these automatic inflationary increases and truly make it something where they decide how much money is going to be taxed and sent to these local subdivisions.
Especially for, districts, school districts that have new schools, parents and students and families and voters are all very happy to see new buildings and new campuses, of which there is an economy of scale there because of what you save with more energy efficient buildings and so forth and so on. Because we've talked about on this program before that school systems had a collective cash carryover of more than $10 billion statewide. Yet there was a story in Cleveland.com this past week. Laura Hancock wrote the story about chronic absenteeism in public schools around the state of Ohio. And I was shocked. I knew it had been a problem during COVID. So it had climbed during COVID in the 2021 school year to 24% chronic absenteeism. In 21-22, it was 30%. 4.5 years later, it's 25.1% statewide, which begs the question, where are these kids? And if you don't know where these kids are to the school districts, why do you need a new school levy?
Well, the concerning thing that we see is that's the average, meaning, of course, basic math understanding says there are school districts above that, there are school districts below that. Some of the worst offenders that we see, Columbus Public, I believe, has a chronic absenteeism rate right around 50%. That means 50% of their kids are not in that school building on a normal basis. That is incredibly concerning because, and it all really, you can trace it, a lot of this back to the disastrous decisions that were made during COVID to take these kids out of the classroom. And in many cases, these kids had nowhere else to go in some circumstances, to take them out of the classroom, to take them out of their learning routine for an entire year. And then all of a sudden, there's a surprise that they don't want to return to the classroom after that. But nevertheless, in the case of the Columbus Public School District, you have a carryover balance of, I think, about $300 million.
Yeah, more than that. 340, I believe, was one of the last figures we had it on the program, but it's more than 300 million.
You would think some of that money could be used to try and get these kids back in the buildings and try to get these kids back, because if these kids aren't learning, they're going to need a large amount of learning remediation. They're going to need a large amount of services later on to get them caught up. And if they don't get caught up, and if they can't graduate high school, and they can't do a number of things that will help them get on a path to success, ultimately it's going to cost us all a lot more money. And so you would hope that there would be a more strategic use of those dollars in trying to address some of their local issues.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly is a social cost, because this is not just about kids who are falling behind. This is about kids who nobody knows where they are. They're probably not going to graduate high school, and the social cost long term costs all the taxpayers, yes. Right? So I was wondering exactly what defines chronic absenteeism. That means you miss 10% of your classes during the school year, or 2 days a week. That's amazing. And so of the breakdown was seniors represented almost 36% of that, juniors 35%, sophomores 31%, and freshmen 31.1% for the 24-25 school year. Absolutely unbelievable when we talk about schools saying, well, we don't have any money. We don't have enough money. We don't like the property tax reform. Yet results matter. One other thing that everybody is wanting to talk about what the results are going to be, we're drawing as part of Article 19, constitutional amendment that 75% of the voters passed back in 2018, is the congressional redistricting process. And I've had to grin a little bit because the Democrats have been talking about ignoring constitutional mandates and constitutional deadlines. And in fact, there is an article here in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and the headline says, "Did GOP lawmakers violate Ohio's Constitution by blowing a redistricting deadline?" Unequivocally, the answer is no. This is a three-part process, isn't it? That starts mainly in September and runs through November.
It is a three-part process, and actually, the deadlines referred to in there are the deadlines to avail yourself of the first or the various individual part of the processes. So the way that it works is you can pass a map with half of the minority party in each chamber voting for it during the month of September during a redistricting year. And that map would last for the remainder of the decade, whether we did it at the beginning of the decade or mid-decade, like where we are right now. You can also pass a map through the Redistricting Commission. And if you pass it at the beginning of the decade and you get 2 of the minority party members to vote for it, then it will last for the entire decade. If you don't pass it with the minority party support at the beginning of the decade, then it becomes a 4-year map, or in the case of at the end of the at the end of the decade or mid-decade where we are right now, you can also go to the third part of the step, which is kind of the fail-safe, where a simple majority of the legislature in the form of a bill can pass a map that would, in the case of the beginning of the decade, would last 4 years. In the case of the mid part of the decade, it would last for 6 years. And so there's also a fourth fail-safe, truth be told, and that's if no map passes, then the same map stays in place. There's a provision of the Constitution that says that. So these are deadlines to avail yourself of those specific steps. They're not deadlines that we must do something or we're compelled to do something during certain dates, point blank. It's more so if you want to take advantage of this step of the process, you have to do it by this date. Naturally, as you might imagine, the way that it reads, if you are the minority party, you have a lot more leverage over this process at the beginning of the decade than in a mid-decade process like we are in right now. Now, I will be the first to say I would like to have a map that is bipartisan, similar to what we did for state legislative redistricting. But at the same time, one has to acknowledge that the minority party loses a lot of the emphasis that they would have on leverage when they don't have as much in return to offer in the form of a decade-long map.
A couple points I wanted to make sure that we briefly talked about is the United States congressional map, the congressional map right now in Ohio, is a constitutional map. I'll say that again. The congressional map in Ohio is constitutional. Remember, the U.S. Supreme Court vacated the narrow 4-3 O'Connor ruling, which by a matter of law, correct me if I'm wrong, you're a lawyer, yes, means that map is then, as a matter of law, at a foundational point, constitutional.
The Supreme Court talked about this an awful lot in their rulings regarding the state legislative maps and the congressional maps, is that they begin at the very outset as being presumed constitutional. And so the burden is on the person who filed the case to prove that they are unconstitutional. And so in the case that we had with the congressional maps, you are correct, the Ohio Supreme Court had originally ruled them unconstitutional. They went up to the United States Supreme Court after that, and the United States Supreme Court vacated that Ohio court ruling, basically saying, poof, it's gone, meaning that the maps are presumed constitutional at that point. There is no ruling saying that they are not constitutional, and it granted review to the United States Supreme Court to review that case again and remanded it down to the Ohio Supreme Court for proceedings consistent with the United States Supreme Court's ruling. And the United States Supreme Court basically said, there are an awful lot of extra constitutional duties that you're imposing upon the map drawers here that are nowhere to be found in the Constitution. You can't do that as a court, and so we're ordering you to redo this whole thing. Now, curiously enough, the people who were bringing the case dismissed the case at that point in time. They didn't want it to go back to the Ohio Supreme Court and risk having the Ohio Supreme Court rule against them. And so that's where we stand right now. We have constitutional maps. The maps, however, expire at the end of the 4-year period.
I think one of the things, too, that has been maybe overstated, it's kind of like the boy who cried wolf. Just because maybe you don't like the map doesn't mean it's gerrymandered. You know, what we hear from the political rhetoric from the other side of the aisle is, it's gerrymandered, it's gerrymandered. Well, they presented an 8-7 map, something that they said was an 8-7 map, something they said was a fair constitutional 8-7 map. So then by default, if you're presenting something that's an 8-7 map set in stone, isn't that a gerrymandered map? I mean, I think gerrymandering in general, the use of the term has gotten way overused, because as long as something is meeting the constitutional directives within, whether it's Article 19 or Article 11 on the House and Senate General Assembly maps, as long as it's found to be constitutional, not gerrymandered. If it's found unconstitutional, then you could make the argument it was gerrymandered.
Well, oftentimes when you are talking about gerrymandering, you're talking about something that is written in such or a map that would be made in such a way exclusively to benefit one party over the other. And of course, it gets used oftentimes where somebody's talking about a map that they simply don't like. Our Constitution really said, look, that can be subjective both ways, one way or the other, if we make it purely about politics. And so our Constitution instead, in the amendment that was approved by the voters, decided to focus on anti-splitting procedures, decided to focus on making sure that you weren't splitting multiple counties across multiple districts, to basically say that, look, we're going to try and keep counties and cities and townships, to the extent we can, whole in a map, instead of having them packed and cracked and dragged all over the place. That's what we've sought out to do in our map-making process here at the state, and every single map that we've come up with. And of course, there will always be arguments from both sides as to why it's good and why it's not good, et cetera. But to the argument that we've heard before, oftentimes when you look at the political geography of the state of Ohio, you kind of have it on that sheet that you have in front of you. It is a sea of red with islands of blue, small islands of blue on it, if we had to color code it by precinct. And so there are only so many places across the entire state that you can even draw majority Democrat districts, especially when you're talking about congressional districts that have to be about 786,000 people. And so naturally, you're going to have to crack up those islands of blue and send them out into the sea of red in order to draw or maximize Democrat districts. And if you're going to do that, very clearly, you're splitting up cities, you're splitting up counties, you're splitting up other communities solely for a political advantage. And that's something that we shouldn't really be seeking to do.
Right, because the current map basically reflects the least amount of divisions within political subdivisions, I think, in the modern history
yes.
of congressional mapmaking in Ohio.
And it's actually about half of the number of splits that would be constitutionally permitted. And so there's actually a number in the Constitution of how many splits that we can have. It's somewhere in the upper to mid-20s. And we have 14, I believe, on the current map as far as political subdivision splits. And so it's much to do about nothing when you talk about some of that stuff. A lot of it's political talking points. That rest assured to the voters out there, our Constitution seeks and indeed mandates that we try to keep counties whole, cities whole, townships whole where possible. Now, when you're drawing maps that have to contain a certain population number, inevitably you're going to have splits of political subdivisions somewhere. It's just the way it's going to have to work out. But when we are splitting up those political subdivisions solely for a political advantage and taking those islands of blue and having them streaking out into the sea of red solely for a political advantage, that to me, in my own subjective view, is gerrymandering.
Yeah, it doesn't represent compact communities of interest whatsoever.
What they always used to like to talk about. Yes.
Exactly. Time flies, doesn't it? Here we are at October, nearing the end of the first year of the 2-year 136th General Assembly. And as we look back over the year, some major pieces of legislation, major wins for the people of Ohio. Senate Bill 1, Senate Bill 2, getting down to a flat tax in the operating budget, the property tax reforms. I mean, there's a lot to stand on as far as work for the people of Ohio.
Yeah, and we sought out at the beginning of this General Assembly and said we're going to do some hard things, things that may not always be the most popular, but they're the right thing to do for the state of Ohio. Starting with Senate Bill 1. Senate Bill 1, higher education reform. We realized that we needed to get higher education in the state of Ohio refocused on what their main goal is, and that's churning out graduates who have the skills and qualifications to be successful in our society and getting away from some of the indoctrination that we're seeing across this country. That's well documented by the political leanings of these professors, well documented by some of the surveys that have been conducted of student bodies. And so we sought to do that. We sought to make sure that the admissions practices reflected that as well, and that people are going to be admitted based upon merit, not based upon other characteristics that have nothing to do with merit. And so we did that, and frankly, it's by and large, when you talk to a lot of these university presidents, many of them will look and in a quiet conversation say, actually, this isn't that bad. We're kind of happy with a lot of the stuff that was in Senate Bill 1. So we're happy to see that. Also, the flat tax. Well, that was one thing that we put in the budget, and it's been a long journey. When I joined the legislature and was sworn into the Ohio House back in 2015, we had 7 income tax brackets, and I believe the highest tax bracket was 7.5%. In 2026, we will have 1 income tax bracket at 2.75%, flat across the board for all Ohioans, which to me is about as fair as you can get. And so we're excited about that, and we can see the results in our economy and our population. For the first time in probably 5 decades, we have net domestic positive migration from people across the country moving into the state of Ohio. And if you look at the U-Haul index, which I'm sure you've talked with
Senator
somebody
Lang.
about, yeah, Senator Lang loves to cite that. The U-Haul index is actually a measure of how many U-Hauls are inbound that aren't returning to their place of origin. And it's a good forward-looking indicator of where you're going to see more population growth. Ohio is actually in the top 15 of that nationally. And so we're starting to see this trend turn around where people are coming into the state of Ohio. There's a lot of investment going on in the state of Ohio. A lot of people are deciding that's where their money is most secure from a regulatory and tax standpoint, and also from a talent standpoint with a lot of the good higher education institutions that we do have here in the state of Ohio who are going to be supplying the workforce of the future. So it's very exciting, and I think it's something that we'll be looking back on here very shortly in the future and saying, look, we really made a difference, and it's resulting in a positive net in migration, and Ohio's population is growing like it has for many other states who have made similar moves.
A diverse choice of career fields as well. Senate Bill 2 with the new energy plan, which I believe turned later into House Bill 15, but it was a unanimous bipartisan vote on both bills, at least in the Senate chamber. How important is that in capitalizing on the natural gas reserves there in southern and southeast Ohio, that eastern third of Ohio that joins Pennsylvania and West Virginia? And as we were talking with Congressman Troy Balderson, former state senator Troy Balderson, he said if you combine those 3 states and the deposits, it's actually bigger than the deposit there in Texas, which is absolutely amazing natural resources for affordable, accountable, and reliable energy.
Yeah, and actually, it's one of those things where I've said many times, one of our greatest competitive advantages here in Ohio is the natural gas right beneath our own soil. It allows us to compete on the national and even the global scale at a rate and in an area and an arena where many states can't, because we can offer affordable, reliable, dispatchable energy that other states cannot. We need to use that to our advantage. We need to use that to our advantage to attract more business and to grow more business that's already here. And so what we sought to do with that bill is make it easier to build natural gas resources, make it easier to build many of the baseload power resources that we see here in the state of Ohio, and make it easier for large-scale energy users to do it behind their own meter, to do it and build and generate and consume their own energy, which means that these data centers that everybody's worried about taking precious resources off of our grids are no longer doing that, or they have an option not to do that. And I would encourage our economic development folks to push them in that direction. That way they're not going to areas like New Albany necessarily that have scarce resources as it is, and taking energy off the grid that could be used for other economic development projects. They're able to go anywhere near a gas pipeline and build and generate their own energy and then cluster data centers around it in what turns out to be, in some cases, investments of over $10 billion. And so as we talk about property taxes and school funding and all of those other things, imagine being some of those school districts across the state of Ohio that are rural in nature, that maybe have a smaller student population as a result, but you get a $10 billion investment in your school district, and that's going to change things fundamentally for decades to come.
Absolutely. Amazing to think that Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, bigger than the Permian Basin in Texas. The political rhetoric has been something that's received a lot of debate, and a lot of people still talking about it. After September 10th, the political assassination of Charlie Kirk, we had pastors Brian Hansen and Brian Solomon on the program not too long ago. Really worth taking a look at on our YouTube channel or on Spotify as well, about bad things happening to good people. But leadership on both sides of the aisle in the Ohio General Assembly a couple weeks ago, obviously you included, put out this statement, and I'll just read part of it. Says, quote, "In a free and democratic society, there is absolutely no place for politically motivated violence, nor should anyone encourage or celebrate this type of heinous criminal behavior. As leaders from different sides of the aisle, we felt it was vital to join together to emphasize the significance of this message as we strongly condemn the assassinations of Charlie Kirk and Minnesota lawmaker Melissa Hortman and her husband, Mark Hortman, earlier this year." Your thoughts about going back one day before the 24th remembrance of 9/11 and the murder on a college campus of Charlie Kirk in front of thousands and thousands of college kids, all for being willing to sit down with these kids and debate those who had a different opinion?
It is antithetical to everything that our country stands for. And he was doing the exact type of activity that our founders envisioned when they formed this country, to be able to go into a town square, if you will, and have a peaceful debate about topics of the day and enjoy your rights to free speech as fundamental rights that were given to you by your Creator. And to think that he would be killed, that a father of two young children, a young married man, really just at the start of his life, the fact that he would be murdered in cold blood in front of the entire country for doing that is just absolutely sickening for any reason, but let alone for him exercising his First Amendment God-given right to free speech. It's really hopefully a wake-up call for this country that we're better than that. We can have our disagreements, and in many cases those disagreements may be heated. And we can have our disagreements, and in many cases they may bring up strong feelings on both sides of the discussion. But we should never resort to violence. And in fact, we should all actively condemn those who decide to resort to violence or those who wish violence upon others. I know there was in the news this week, there were reports that a candidate for Attorney General in Virginia decided that he wanted to send text messages to another member who I believe of the General Assembly down there, House of Delegates, when he was in it, that he wished that the Speaker of the Virginia House would be killed. 2 bullets to the head, I think, is one of the things he said. And then he also said that he wished that there would be violence upon the children that he had, and that maybe that if those children were dying in the arms of his wife, that maybe his political views would change. That type of rhetoric is so disgusting, and that type of discussion has no place in this country.
It should be disqualifying.
It should be disqualifying. Notice how we're not mentioning the party of the person who said this, because I think this should be a nonpartisan issue. This should be a nonpartisan issue that we all should agree upon, regardless of the party that you're in. If somebody makes those kind of statements, if somebody wishes violence upon any other person for their political beliefs, and especially if somebody wishes somebody's kids to die, that should be so revolting and so disgusting to any person who has an ounce of reasonableness that it should just be absolutely condemned on all sides of the aisle and from all corners of this country. And so what it is, I believe, is a wake-up call that we all need to realize that sometimes this heated rhetoric, sometimes it's this misleading rhetoric that may be for a short-term political gain, oftentimes may lead to consequences that may be unintended down the road. Maybe groups of people who become radicalized and indoctrinated to think a certain way and feel that type of conversation is justified. You see it even in polling of young people that's come out since then, that there are certain segments of young people who feel like political violence is justified in alarmingly high numbers.
We wrote about that on the Record 2 weeks ago. You can find our story, ohiosenate.gov, go over to news. We're the first drop down on the Record, and you can find that story. I couldn't believe what the percentage was.
Yeah. It's a wake-up call for everybody. I'll be the first to say, Leader Antonio and I, Minority Leader Antonio, Democrat, and I have always had a good working relationship. We've always been able to share a laugh on occasion on the floor. We've gotten to know each other. There are several other members of the Democrat caucus. Bill DeMora, who is sometimes giving the most fiery speeches against what we're doing on the floors. Bill DeMora and I actually will talk about Ohio State football with each other for hours on end sometimes, because it's something that brings us together. We don't talk about politics. We don't talk about his side of the aisle or my side of the aisle. We found that common ground, and we talk about Ohio State football, and we recall games for the last 20 or 30 years, and as something that we can talk about and bond and develop a friendship over. And I feel like that's become lost in our political dialogue, where even around here, around Cap Square, you have a lot of people who maybe were here 20 or 30 years ago who would tell you, look, we would have it out on the floor, and we'd give fiery debates, and we would really advocate for our side, and then afterwards we'd go grab dinner and talk about each other's families. And I feel like that gets lost a little bit in today's day and age. And frankly, I think we all need to realize that the person on the other end of any conversation we're having is a human. That person on the other end of that conversation oftentimes has their own family, has their own kids, has their own life, has people that love them, and they're deserving in those cases of our dignity and our respect.
It makes me think about the courage it took to go to college campuses and sit down and have just a straightforward one-on-one with kids who said they're atheists or whatever they were, and Charlie Kirk would just sit there and calmly listen and then have a direct answer. I felt he was always courteous. But isn't that also reflective of the importance of the constitutional civic centers that were passed as well as part of the budget to try to end a lot of the indoctrination, to try to bring a sense of what does the Constitution say, and let's have a dialogue about that on a young adult on a young adult scale on college campuses, to try to have that good-natured back and forth debate?
So we, in the lead up to Senate Bill 1 and in the lead up to the budget bill 2 years ago, which put in place these civic centers, we had data from Ohio colleges, surveys from Ohio colleges, where students at a higher and higher rate felt like they could not speak their political opinions on college campus without fear of retribution. We had, in many cases, or actually in one case in particular, UCLA actually has been doing studies for years about the self-reported political ideology of college faculty. Self-reported. This isn't made up. There's not an algorithm to figure this out. This is self-reported political leanings. And the amount of people who have self-reported as leaning to the left on college campuses compared to those who lean to the right, it used to be about 2 to 1. We all know it's never been something that's been even or that it favored people on the Republican side of the aisle. But now it's about 7 to 1. And so you see that trend over just the last 20 years or so that has happened. And it leads us as policymakers to acknowledge and realize that this has gone out of balance. We need areas where these students can learn how to have thoughtful discussions and debate without fear of political retribution. And these civic centers will allow for that, and that they are insulated from outside influence within the normal bureaucracy of the university. They answer directly to the president of the university, and allow for that president to really operate them as centers of free speech, really. And I hope that's, in many cases, when you get outside of the political disagreements that may have led up to them, we've had leaders in the university circles and administrations on both sides of the aisle acknowledge the good that these institutions are going to do, because they realize it's not to get Republican thought in or Democrat thought in. It's so the two sides can get in and have a thoughtful debate and bring speakers from both sides of the argument, and so those students can have a mentally stimulating conversation about the ideas of the day and draw their own conclusions. What a novel theory. I thought that was what college was supposed to be about. And so those centers are doing good work already.
I love that. Freedom of speech centers. Senate President Rob McColley, Republican from Napoleon, Ohio. Great to have you back on the program. Thanks for your perspective and insight as always.
Yeah, very happy to be here. Thanks, John.
Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.